Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive paradigm shift in how we think about modern workplace dynamics. We are going to look closely at how one of the most universally praised, almost unquestioned management philosophies out there might actually be quietly fracturing your team from the inside out. It's a fascinating structural problem, and we're going to break it all down using the raw data and the system logic that finally makes this hidden dynamic visible. So if you've spent any time in corporate management, read a leadership book, or gone to literally any modern HR seminar, I guarantee you have heard this phrase, great work environments let people pursue their own goals, right? It's basically treated as corporate gospel at this point. We all kind of just assume that giving people unstructured autonomy, letting them forge their own solitary path, is the ultimate signal of a healthy, trusting workplace. But I want you to pause for a second and really question that assumption. Is unstructured autonomy actually always the end goal, or are we perhaps just projecting our own desires onto a highly complex, interconnected system? Well, the hard data actually completely shatters that core assumption. A global XING corporate culture assessment went looking for this exact dynamic, and they uncovered a stark, genuinely surprising negative correlation. Specifically, negative 0.2119. When employees were asked to evaluate the ideal interaction within a great working environment, the option that stated people can pursue their own goals actually yielded a strong negative correlation with specific achievement-oriented mindsets. And just to be clear, this is not some small, localized glitch in the data. We're talking about a study spanning 44 countries and 7 different languages, with a sample size of over 200 participants. It clears rigorous statistical thresholds, passing the critical R student test at 0.1354. It zeroes right in on the orange vMEME in spiral dynamics, which, if you're familiar, is the mindset focused entirely on achievement, efficiency, and scaling. And what the data tells us is honestly fascinating. As this orange, achievement-oriented mindset strengthens within a team, unstructured individual autonomy actually loses its value. It stops being a positive workplace signal entirely. What we're really looking at here is a massive structural pattern shift. The old way of thinking, this isolated goal pursuit, assumes that individual drive will just automatically translate into value for the company. But for that highly driven orange mindset, a totally new requirement emerges: merit-based collaboration. Because without a structured, meritocratic system to actually capture and measure impact, individual ambition just turns into uncoordinated energy. The friction happens when personal goals stop feeding into the collective output, and suddenly that highly celebrated autonomy transforms from a cultural asset into a literal cost center. So this brings us to a really critical question, one you probably need to be asking yourself right now. What does pursue your own goals actually mean to the people on your team? The reality is, a single management signal, like granting autonomy, does not have a universal translation. In a complex, living organism like a business, that one simple signal fractures into completely different meanings, entirely depending on the underlying psychological value systems of the people receiving it. When we map this divergence out across the different psychological stages of spiral dynamics, the spread is just massive. Say you tell a team driven by the blue mindset, a mindset that deeply values safety, order, and rules, to just pursue their own goals. They aren't going to feel liberated. Actually, they're going to feel immense anxiety over a sudden loss of clear direction and procedural clarity. Then you have the green mindset, which values community and connection above all. They perceive that exact same unstructured autonomy as a loss of authentic team expression and shared psychological safety. And then there's the yellow mindset. They think in complex systems, so they look at unstructured goal pursuit and simply see a poorly designed, highly inefficient structure that lacks the contextual freedom they need for true adaptive space. Okay, so the data clearly proves that treating pursue your own goals as the ultimate management ideal totally misfires with high achievement teams, and it deeply confuses order-driven, community-driven, and system-driven mindsets. But you might be wondering, what happens if we just pull the plug? What if we remove this individualist signal from our workplace design entirely? Does the environment just magically realign itself once this problematic anchor is gone? Short answer, no. It definitely doesn't just magically align. The system actually reacts defensively. If you strip away individual goal pursuits without replacing it with a far better collective structure, your teams are going to instantly fragment into output silos. Without that interaction baseline to rely on, the blue mindset overcompensates by aggressively tightening procedural standards. The green mindset starts feeling completely disconnected, losing its sense of authentic self-expression. And the yellow mindset completely loses its ability to navigate the organization adaptively. And here's the worst part. Managers totally misread this dynamic. They see the rigid structural clarity that blue is suddenly demanding, and they misinterpret it as a need for more control, which just ends up suffocating innovation readiness across the whole board. It is literally a domino effect, a perfect map of an escalation cascade. Think of it as the butterfly effect of management. Step 1. It starts with simple signal misalignment. You offer autonomy, but it's interpreted by the team as chaos or inefficiency. Step 2. This inevitably leads to talent misfires. Your highly ambitious people quit because their impact isn't being measured, and your community-focused people check out because they feel totally isolated. Step 3. Cultural fragmentation sets in deeply as these different groups retreat into their own defensive corners. And finally, Step 4. System distrust. Researchers call this a leadership legitimacy crash. At this point, you haven't just lost productivity. You've literally lost the authority to lead because your team's hidden psychological wiring has actively rejected your management signals. So, how on earth do we prevent this kind of crash? Well, we introduce a framework known as the algebra of conscience. Now, I know that sounds a bit like poetry, but it is actually a highly rigorous, dynamic programming model built on 13,000 real-world correlations. It essentially maps the true soul of a company. It takes ethical choices, fears, trust levels, and psychological state vectors and integrates them into a solvable mathematical equation. It takes all the squishy, completely unpredictable human elements of management and makes them calculable. Because relying on gut instinct, which we just saw is incredibly dangerous when words like autonomy mean totally different things to different people, is a recipe for disaster. With this, we can actually calculate the ripple effects of our management actions before we make them. The predictive implication here is absolutely massive. To actually navigate this complexity, you've got to follow a 3-step logic. First, you have to model the different interpretations of autonomy specific to your team's exact psychological profile. Second, you map the divergence, meaning what will actually happen if you introduce or remove that anchor. And third, you have to permanently shift to relying on system modeling over your own assumptions. Because if you don't use dynamic modeling to understand the specific psychological vectors of your team, your management predictions, like assuming everyone just naturally loves pursuing their own goals, become completely catastrophically unreliable. Which brings us to the SD Navigator interface. And what is truly mind-blowing about this isn't just what it does, but how it was built. This is a perfect example of this massive 2026 trend we're seeing called AI vibe coding. Nobody sat down and wrote traditional code for this interface. Instead, a user utilized natural language to instruct a large language model, in this case Claude, to build this highly complex, completely system-aware UI. You are literally looking at a dynamic programming model that was brought to life simply by describing the vibe and the complex structural needs of that mathematical framework. By using system-aware prompts, the AI generates context-sensitive outputs that actively calibrate workplace interaction. It maps the blue, orange, and green mindsets using state vectors, while psychological sensors continuously track things like fear, trust, and well-being. Then it calculates different hypothetical management actions, say granting unpaid vacation time, and processes the collective feelings of the entire organization to spit out what's called a J-score. That J-score is your stability score. It mathematically forces you to balance your decisions to maximize both engagement and stability. It proves, once and for all, that reading the room isn't some mystical art form anymore. It is literally computable empathy. We have covered a massive amount of ground today, from completely shattering the myth of universal autonomy, all the way to exploring the algebra of conscience and the wild frontier of AI vibe coding. But the absolute core takeaway you need to remember is this. Your organization is a highly complex organism, and relying on universal one-size-fits-all assumptions is a fast track to a leadership legitimacy crash. I want to leave you with a provocative thought to mull over today. What truly breaks when individual goal signals stop being universal in work environments? If an algorithm can understand the psychological wiring of your team significantly better than your own gut instinct, what does that actually mean for the future of how we lead? It's fascinating stuff for sure. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.